Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out, braving this cold weather and rain. Of course, most of us on the Palouse are kind of used to this. But this is our kickoff event for our MLK speaker series. And so we want to welcome you all here tonight as we have a very short and sweet program for you. We're going to feature two poets, our Campus Civic Poet winner, Mr. Joel. How you say your last name again? I don't want to mess it up. Kemigay. Okay. And we also have a special guest from Pullman High School, a junior who had a wonderful poem that just kind of resonated around campus, so much so that my son was bragging about it. And I was like, well, you know what? Let's invite her to this event tonight and let her showcase her skills. And so Miss Louise Najuko will be giving us a poem as well. And so tonight, we're going to have those two poets, and then myself and Dr. Fleming will have a facilitated conversation, and then we'll open the floor for you all to ask questions of the speaker, and then we'll get you out and get you home. And so Dr. Fleming was very adamant about making sure that you all had the opportunity to ask questions. That's what she really wanted to do. And so we'll have a very short facilitated conversation, but please make sure you ask questions so that, we can get the most out of that. And so we're going to kick it off by inviting Louise to come up and recite her poem. So give her a hand as she comes up. You want me to hold it for you?
Yes. I am an African child. Can you tell that I'm an African child? I am an African child who is proud to be African. I, like many millions of African children, am Black with kinky hair and a sharp mind. What can I say? I am proud of who I am, because my color alone can make me proud of being an African child. I am an African child who values their culture. From the unique characteristics and styles to the arts and many more is what I value as an African child. Language to me is like a song. From the many words to the perfect beat to an African song is what I most value as an African child. I am an African child who is a child of God. For it has been said in the Bible that God loves every child. For I am an endowment in God's glory, an ornament and of the radiance of God's glory, fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of his glory. I am a child of God. I am an African child who has talent to be the best that I can be in this world. My future will not be the very worst, but the very best as an Olympic star's gold medal. For I thrive and dream for that door to be open one day. I am an African child with the right and freedom to be who I am meant to be. Yes, I am an African child who dreams like Martin Luther King Jr., for he never gave up on that right to be free. I'm an African child who shines like the many stars in the night sky, who is uniquely gifted to be who I am meant to be, whose next generation of African children will not be the very worst but prevail, and who will teach others to be the greatest in this world full of aspiration. I am an African child. Yes, I am an African child, with many dreams so big that in the darkness of this world there will be light from the night sky, shown towards the path of significance. I am an African child.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Louise. That was fantastic. Next, we'll have our Campus Civic poet, Mr. Joel Kemigay.
Oh, no, I can. Is it okay if I sit down? No, I need to sit down. Okay. This first poem is, I'm only doing one poem, sorry. This poem is called Afrocentric Studies Overview. You're gonna hear like part 1, part 2, part 3. I promise they're all really short. You're not gonna be here for like 4 hours. The first lesson is Black students learn a new lesson every day. Like one in my class sees blood on her textbooks, but that's just, sorry. The first lesson is Black students learn a new lesson every day. Like one in my class sees blood on her textbooks, but that's just because a previous student owned it. One student fails every test because he can't memorize every name. The lesson being, he will fail every test. They are always adding names and making bloody textbooks. The first lesson is Afrocentric studies is relentless. When they are pounding your head so hard the next 7 generations feels it, it feels like it goes on forever. Part 2. History, your history, is a violent circle. My great-grandfather was killed the same time Breonna Taylor was. You're probably dying the same day I am. They take the same steps back every day and spit forward. But your history is joy. We study Black smiles, and you and your grandparents, you and your grandchildren are smiling at the same time. The studies are to figure out why they smile harder. Part 3. But one more lesson before we leave. Afrocentric studies is you. Black, bad, and icon, you will feed Malcolm's fire and lick the White House clean. Black, you used to have a price. They don't know what to do with you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. See, the future is bright in poetry on the Palouse. Happy about that. So we're going to jump right into tonight's main event. As I said, it's short and sweet. So I'll begin by introducing Dr. Crystal Fleming. She's an award-winning sociologist, writer, and public intellectual known for her frank talk and humor. Dr. Crystal Fleming is a professor of sociology and Africana studies at SUNY Stony Brook. She's an author, public intellectual, and expert on global racism and white supremacy. Crystal completed her PhD at Harvard University and continues to publish scholarly research on racial oppression and anti-racism. Her provocative writing, lectures, and workshops engage a wide array of scholarly and social topics related to racism and anti-racism. She's the author of several books, including her critically acclaimed primer, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, on racism, white supremacy, and the racial divide, and her first young adult book, Rise Up, you can see the picture there, and how you can join the fight against white supremacy. Her work and commentary are regularly featured in a range of national and international media. So if you can all please help me in welcoming Dr. Crystal Fleming. Sounds like.
Thank you for that warm
They told me to say.
welcome. You're like, I just...
No. So we'll kick it off really, with a question about your book. So you wrote a book about how to be less stupid about race, and that's an essential guide to breaking through half-truths and ridiculous misconceptions that have corrupted the way race is represented in the classroom, pop culture, media, and politics. Why did you think writing this book was important?
Gosh, why do we need a book called How to Be Less Stupid About Race? I mean, you tell me. No, I mean it. Like, think about conversations you've had. Think about things you've seen on social media, on the regular media. Think about how little we learn about our real history, the history of racism in this country, the history of racism on the globe. We don't learn about these issues. And I see it at every level of education. I'm a professor, went to graduate school to study sociology, and actually went to Harvard with the intention of, studying racism, both in the US and in Europe. And I have a lot of criticisms about Harvard, I'm gonna tell you that for sure. So part of what I write about in the book is racism in higher education, in bastions of academia like Harvard, places that are very influential, where racist thought thrives and practices, where scientific racism was popularized at places like Harvard. So first, I think just being in academia for so long as a Black woman, as a Black queer woman, someone interested in intersectionality, studying these issues in a global lens, and in the lead up to Trump's first presidency, the level of the political discourse across the political spectrum was just so infuriatingly insipid. So I think I just felt super like motivated and frustrated and just like, I don't know if we can curse tonight, so I don't know. Can I curse? But yeah, I was tired of the bullshit, you know? So I'm so glad we started with poetry, because I wrote poetry as a kid. Creative writing used to be my thing, and then I went to graduate school and ended up with like 10 years of writing blocks, seriously. So I went from like writing poetry and going to poetry events as a college student, and even in high school I wrote poetry, to only being able to write analytically and in a certain kind of academic jargon. And I got sick of it. And so when I started my tenure track position at Stony Brook out in New York 12 years ago, I made a commitment to myself to not just focus on like turning my dissertation into a book. I had to do that though, so I did do it. But to get back into, creative writing, also to nurture my well-being. And so I started to write. So that's kind of like the prelude to writing a book like How to Be Less Stupid About Race. I tried to find my voice again, and to do so in a way that wasn't primarily or even at all at first for an academic audience, but was also not for an external audience, it was for me. I started blogging, I started writing music, singing, and just kind of, again, finding my voice. And because of my interest in anti-racism, it became important for me also to find ways to write about these topics that was not full of jargon and that was accessible. And I found that that was actually useful, not just for bringing this research out into the world, but also in the classroom, right? We need to be able to talk about sophisticated, complicated ideas and complex histories in a way that makes sense and isn't full of sociological jargon. So little by little, right, finding my voice, and becoming frustrated with the very abysmal level of understandings and misunderstandings around race, just to start there, among other issues, motivated me to want to write a book like this and to write about some of these topics that I also address in my scholarship, but in a way that was more accessible and that also blended in, some memoir, some cuss words appear in the text. I know it's not shown anymore, but I didn't curse in my YA book. They told me they won't put them in the high school bookshelves and libraries if there's too many cuss words. So I don't cuss in that book. But just to really like be multivocal, right? So it kind of shift in the book between, some parts are kind of academic when I get into like what is critical race theory. I know we're going to talk about that too. Into also language that, I don't know, I feel comfortable in. So that was my motivation, and I wanted folks who have, experienced racial oppression and the pain of dealing with other people's racial ignorance to feel validated by some of what I share in the book.
Awesome. You talk about jargon and sociological jargon. And so one of the things that I've noticed in this kind of work is that people take advantage of sociological jargon because people don't know the definitions. So it's easy for them to define it how they want to define it.
Yeah.
So words like woke and all of this gets these alternative definitions.
Woke.
And one of the things that you kind of touched on that we're going to jump to next is critical race theory. As you see, several states are restricting or outright banning critical race theory. Mm-hmm. You've studied this, you've written extensively about it. So can you explain what it is and why you believe it is under attack in America?
There's just so much in your rich question there. There's the stuff about woke, which is connected to attacks on CRT. I'm going to answer these questions, but first I want to ask y'all some questions because it connects to why are there attacks on what is being called critical race theory, okay? So a couple of questions for you, if you'll bear with me. Okay, if you are able to, I want you to stand if your answer to the question I'm about to ask is yes, okay? And then when I ask that question, and if you respond yes, if you're still standing, I'm gonna ask a couple more questions, and if your answer is still yes, remain standing, and if the answer is no, you can sit down. Okay, this is if you're able to stand. If you can't stand, you can put your hand in the air. Okay, all right, anyone who wants to play along. All right, first question, it's an easy one, so I hope most of y'all stand up. Please stand or put your hand in the air if you have talked about racism with members of your family or friends. If you've talked about racism with members of your family or friends. If you can't stand, you can put your hand up. Okay, most of you talking about it in some way. Now, I'm not asking you what you said or who, all right, there might have been some racial ignorance up in there, but okay, if you talking about it, okay. All right, so next question, remain standing if the answer is yes. Please remain standing if you have read a book about racism or anti-racism. If your answer is yes, remain standing. If you have not, in all honesty, read a book, sit down, because I'm going to ask you what you read. I appreciate the honesty. I appreciate your honesty, okay? All right, for those of you who are still standing, I'm going to maybe, I know this is the scary part. I know, you know I'm coming over there. What did you read? Okay, while you're thinking about it, what did you read?
Black Like Me.
Black Like Me, okay, what did you read?
I read Black Like Me, but that's not what I want to say. But since I read, I'll say Black Like Me.
Okay, we'll go with that. What did you read in the green?
Not anything specific, but I have my PhD in literature, so it's
You can't give me one thing you read?
a lot of things I have to.
Okay, about an author.
It's not escaping me right now.
Okay, I don't know if you should be standing, but okay, all right. One last one. What did you read? Some of us. The some of us, yes. Some of us, yes. Okay, all right. Next and last question. Please remain standing if you have ever taken a course, a whole class that was actually focused on racism or anti-racism. A class at any level of education, K through 12, college, graduate school. Now let's look around, right? Most of us were standing in the beginning, and there are very few of us who are still standing. And the number of people who are standing in this room, this is way more than you'll find on average. You can be seated now. Because the fact that we don't have many classes and courses that focus on these issues, this is not like random. It's not by chance. It's by design. It's by design. We don't have an educational system that educates us on these issues. And to the contrary, what we have when you start to study not just the history of racism, but the history of racism in education, we have generations of young people, of children, being miseducated with racist ideology in the classroom. Textbooks that celebrate slavery, and we still have that. We still have textbooks that talk in glowing terms about slavery or perpetuate that stereotype of the happy slave. We still have that, but we've had generations of that. We have generations of students not learning about colonization from the perspective of indigenous people. We have generations of students who don't learn about the historical construction of whiteness. The fact that the idea of whiteness is a modern invention. The idea of race is new. Human beings have existed for, anyone know how long? Anthropologists in the room, how long have Homo sapiens been around? A long ass time. Couple 100,000 years, right? The idea of race and the practice of racism only stretches back a couple of 100 centuries. Now, our whole life, that's our whole life and our recent ancestors' lives. So it's right, I'm not minimizing it, but it's historically new. We don't learn about it. And so you can become a professor, you can become a judge, you can become a president, You can become a prosecutor. You can become a police officer. You can be anything you want in this country and never have taken a course that actually addresses the history and ongoing realities of racism. That's fucked up. It makes me angry, and it makes me sad for my country, because it means people in positions of power of all backgrounds, right? It's not just white Americans who don't study this history. When we don't have it in our educational system, it means that we have people in positions of power and influence who are reproducing racial and racist ignorance. And we're all shaped by it, no matter what our identity is. Now, the consequences of that racial ignorance are not the same for all of us, because our positionality matters. But that, that is part of what we're dealing with when it comes to critical race theory and attacks on it. We're dealing with a context in the country where our true history has never been systematically taught. And it's not just an issue in the United States. I'm interested in global racism. So revisionist history is a really big problem worldwide. And with nationalism really on the rise globally, you have countries like Japan that over the last 15, 20 years, you've seen a huge effort by the Japanese government to whitewash Japanese atrocities from the educational curriculum. In France, where I spent some years living and doing research, you've had in the last, I'd say 10 years especially, a huge backlash against scholars doing decolonial and anti-racist work, to the point where that work gets called like terroristic work. It's a very scary situation that we have around the world. So it's not just the US, but so when you have misinformation about CRT, what's really happening is that those in power who benefit from the status quo don't want us to learn our history, because once you start to learn this history, if you have a moral compass, you want to build a better world and a better society. You want to get involved in anti-racism. You want to get involved in social justice. And knowledge is power. We live in a country where, dating back to the colonial era, it was illegal to learn how to read if you were an enslaved person. It was illegal if you were a white person or a free black person, a person of color, to teach others how to read. So attacks on anti-racist education need to be contextualized with this longer history of attacks on literacy and education, period, in this country. Sadly, this is not a nation that values education. And that's a much broader conversation. But so briefly, I am long-winded, so I might be lying about briefly here, but I do want to answer also the part of your question about what even is CRT. Let me see a show of hands. If you feel like you actually know what CRT is, could I just see your hand? Do you know what critical race theory is? Okay, and if you don't feel confident that you know what it is, can I see your hand? Who doesn't quite know, right? That's normal. Why would you know? Why would you know what critical race theory is, right? And the fact that most people don't know, it means that it's easy to manipulate folks, because you can just fearmonger about it, and it's like, oh gosh, it sounds bad, if you haven't been studying these issues. So what even is CRT? The actual brief story is this. Critical race theory, it's a body of academic research, scholar research, that comes out of something called critical legal studies. So it's legal scholars, that's where it started. It started in the 1980s. But who were these scholars, right? Who was Derek Bell? Who was Kimberly Crenshaw? Who was Mary Matsuda? These folks of diverse backgrounds, white Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, and others, Latinx folks who were involved in founding this. These were lawyers who came out of the civil rights movement. These were civil rights advocates. And what they were confronted with was the following, and I apologize, this isn't brief, but it's important because we don't know what critical race theory is, right? This is what they were dealing with. 1950s into the 1960s, the modern civil rights movements, right? We had important changes in our laws, right? We have to admit, the United States of the 1960s, post-1965, it's not the same legal, right, apparatus as it was 100 years prior. It was a significant change. But what these advocates and civil rights activists saw is that something didn't change. And what that something was white supremacy. You suddenly had a country that, according to its own laws, was race neutral. After centuries of overt racial oppression, you get a few civil rights laws and it's like, you know what? We're good now. We are equal before the law. And so these lawyers, right, who were on the ground working in the civil rights movement, they began to be confronted with this legal problem. How do you address the ongoing effects of centuries of overt racism, overt white supremacy, the law, literally the laws of our land? How do you address that when now we have laws and jurisprudence that's saying we're race neutral now? It's all good. And you also had the dismantling of the very modest efforts that were made around affirmative action very quickly. As soon as we had, and again, I say very modest efforts around affirmative action, we had I want to say it's 1978 Bakke decision. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Supreme Court decision, but it made racial quotas illegal in education because a white male medical student felt discriminated against because of the use of racial quotas. Now, late 1970s, we're barely a decade past some of the civil rights legislation, and white backlash to these very modest efforts was powerful and effective. The Supreme Court said, yeah, we agree with you. We cannot have quotas that are trying to address past racism because that would be unfair to white Americans. This is what we're dealing with, and that has been the legal context around affirmative action since the 1970s, right? So that is where CRT comes from. It comes from civil rights advocates working in the law, trying to support activists, trying to support racial justice in this country, and coming up against the law as a barrier to social justice and equity, which is not so surprising. We think about Martin Luther King Jr. He was arrested. The law was used to criminalize his anti-racist work. And that's been true throughout our history. When the fight for abolition, right? When you stand up for racial justice, you have to bump up against white supremacist laws. So because of critical race theory, we are not surprised that those in power use the law to criminalize anti-racist education, because that's what you would predict based on what has happened throughout our history. So to wrap this long-winded answer up, I've told you where it comes from, so that it literally comes out of the civil rights movement into legal scholars. Then over a few decades, other fields began to integrate some CRT. We're talking, when I say fields, we're talking academic fields, really like graduate level work. But what is it? So it involves an acknowledgement of structural and systemic racism. It involves the clarity of naming the type of racism that's been institutionalized in the United States, because racism is a very broad term, right? And there's a whole, historical literature around the emergence of racism, outside of the US and all of it. But what kind of racism do we have in the US that's been institutionalized? It's not Native American supremacy. It's not Asian American supremacy. It's not Black supremacy. The only type of racist ideology that's ever been institutionalized in the United States is white supremacy. And so critical race theory has been so helpful in just literally naming it. Because if we can't name it, we're not going to understand how society's been structured, whether we're talking about laws or we're talking about education or we're talking about culture. So that's part of what CRT does. CRT also critiques, and this is where it's easy to get confused, right? It critiques the idea of color blindness. And this is tricky for some people who are new to these issues, because why would you critique color blindness? Didn't Dr. King have a dream? Right? And aren't we supposed to be beyond race? Aren't we supposed to You know, not judge each other by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character, right? That's the only version of Dr. King you hear about, right? Sanitized version of Dr. King. So CRT critiques colorblindness. Why? Because, going back to the law, the pretense that the United States has gotten above or beyond race is part of what maintains the system of white supremacy. Pretending that we're now race neutral, right? Pretending as though the centuries of racism that our country has been built on disappeared in 1965. That claim of neutrality and color blindness is used to maintain the status quo. So that's why it's critiqued. The other thing too about Dr. King, because we're here in large part because of him, right?
Next question is on that.
We're gonna keep it going on Dr. King. But I just want to say quickly about Dr. King and the Disney version of Dr. King that we get, where all we hear about is the mountaintop and the dream and not judging each other by the color of our skin. The version of Dr. King we don't hear about, we don't learn about in school, is the version that sounds like critical race theorists. In the 1960s, and we talked about this in the workshop today on anti-racist pedagogy, Dr. King described white supremacy in the same terms that I'm using. He described it as having been embedded in every textbook in this country, preached from every pulpit, and he said it became a structured part of the culture. A structured part of the culture, right? We don't learn from the structural insights of Dr. King, but this is what is now under the label of CRT. And really what that label is doing, it's not talking about the critical legal studies and civil rights advocacy that is actually what is the origin of critical race theory. It's using that as a boogeyman to demonize all of anti-racist education. We're seeing books by Toni Morrison, books about Rosa Parks, books that address a history and ongoing reality that makes those in power uncomfortable. We're seeing that criminalized, that to study that is somehow wrong, right? But again, CRT would predict, like actual CRT would predict this. Actual CRT would pay attention to how the law gets used to bolster the power of those who are already in power. And it also is about, well, how do you address that, right? Within the law, within policies. So I love critical race theory. It's one of, a number of fields of thought that's important for me. Black studies is important for me. Indigenous studies is important for me. Black feminist thought, broadly queer, work. All of this work is important for me. CRT is being used, again, to fearmonger and to really as a reaction to, when did we start to see these attacks on CRT? Anybody remember? It's quite recent, but it has a particular moment where it popped off. Does anyone remember when it started to happen? (2020). In response to, in the wake of the murder, the public murder of George Floyd, the killing of Breonna Taylor and others, in response to the unprecedented marches and uprisings, not just in this country, across the world. And this fear-mongering about CRT and anti-racist education was in response to that. They were afraid, those who were pushing these kinds of laws, because they saw people standing up, people who had never marched for racial justice before, young people, older people, intergenerational movements. And they saw an opportunity to shut it down. Well, they weren't successful. Movements are still ongoing. Anti-racism is not shut down. We are continuing the work that Dr. King, right, himself was continuing, building on generations of activists. And although I know it can be demoralizing, it's actually over 30 states that have been debating legislation that would criminalize aspects of not just anti-racist education, but a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion, work about gender, and don't say gay, right? All of this work that's associated with uplifting the experiences and voices of historically marginalized communities, right? Those in power who feel threatened by that are using their means. And so resistance continues, right? And the work continues. And if we pay attention to the knowledge and insights of folks like Dr. King, we're not surprised by it, but hopefully we're inspired, right? To keep up the work of educating our communities, not letting folks be and not letting ourselves be manipulated by this fear-mongering, and actually learning from and reading the work of people like King and reading about not just civil rights, you know, well-known civil rights activists like Rosa Parks, but also looking at the knowledge of indigenous people and others who are often excluded from our curricula. So that's my really not brief answer to what CRT is and why it's being attacked.
And the funny thing is you kind of answered the next two questions.
Good.
But we'll still push forward. But
All right.
you kind of mentioned the Disneyification of,
Yeah.
if that's a word, of
We're
Martin
going
Luther
with
King.
it, yeah.
And you talked about the laws that are being passed. And so in recent years, many of us who are on social media, we tend to see, you know, around MLK birthday, people who seem to love MLK all of a sudden, and they want to quote the content of the character quote, and they use that as a way to attack diversity, equity, and inclusion, and social justice. And so for me, it's kind of frustrating. So it's very frustrating to hear people use his words and his works out of context.
Yeah.
And so is this whitewashing and misrepresentation of MLK emblematic of the laws that we see passed now, such as the Stop Woke Act in Florida and in other places?
Another really rich and complex, multifaceted question, right? I want to start with Martin Luther King Jr. Day, like the actual day that's now a vacation. And I want to be very honest, like I feel conflicted about it and sometimes really sad about the holiday. And I know it's something that people fought for and it has value, but when I see white people just taking a vacation day and people who are not black just enjoying a day off in honor of a man who was assassinated. And it's not as though that day is used to advance anti-racist education across the country. Because if, you know, the day was connected to efforts throughout the country to teach the real history, even just not even all of black history or all of US history of racism or all of white history around racism, there's the true history of Dr. King. We don't have anything that is sort of structurally done to address this sanitized, not even sanitized, distorted version of Dr. King that we get. And so for me, it's really, disrespectful is not the right word. It's not harsh enough. It's revolting to see how he gets used to advance racism. Decades after his murder. It's heartbreaking for me. And so when, on the flip side, when folks and colleagues like you, some of you in the audience, who are not doing that, the norm, right? And you're actually creating space for us to address his true legacy, I feel so honored to be a part of these kinds of initiatives. And it's so important and powerful because when we learn about Dr. King's structural analysis of racism, but also the version of Dr. King we don't hear about is how he connected the fight against racism to the fight against poverty and the fight against militarism. And it was probably those connections, right? His speech, if you've never read it, his speech against the Vietnam War, that upset not just those who were celebrating US intervention, but also black liberals who thought he had gone too far. You should read his speech. He understood that when we invest millions or billions into war, that means we're taking those resources away from the poor and from efforts to fight racism. And it was probably because of these kinds of connections, his critique of militarism and war and poverty, right? That strikes to the core of capitalism. It's probably because of these connections that he was killed. It certainly didn't help his predicament. So this is dangerous knowledge for those who are afraid of change, for those who can't imagine a different way of organizing in our society where we can all flourish, right? People who are invested in this old model, it's really a scarcity model. When we think about what white supremacy and other kinds of ideologies around dominance and superiority and inferiority, it's a scarcity model where by design, there's not enough resources to go around. And so greed justifies, right, channeling resources to those who benefit from the system and depriving them from those who don't. And if we can just pause and imagine like Dr. King's beloved community, which is something that he wrote about and spoke about too, right? How do we build a society where we're not seeing each other or ourselves through this lens of not just racism, but again, like ideas of superiority and inferiority, but where we can actually flourish in our humanity together? That's a whole new world, right? And those who are invested in the system as it is today don't want that to come about. The great news, that's the bad news. The great news is that there are lots of folks who do want to imagine otherwise and create otherwise, and they're already doing it. And that work has been ongoing for generations. So if you are involved, in work around addressing poverty or racism or inequality in any way, I want to encourage you, no matter how bleak it may seem, or no matter how much pushback you get, to keep going. Keep going, because everyone in this room has a sphere of influence. Whether you're a student or a staff member, a community member, or educator, you've got people who are watching you, who are listening to you, and who are influenced by what you express, by your values, by your action. And everyone in here can make a positive difference. But it's a lifelong commitment. Not everyone is down for that lifelong work, right? But some of us are. And no matter where you are, sort of in your path, there's a place for you in Dr. King's imagined beloved community. So that's the part of his legacy too that I'd like to see more of us lean into.
And this is our last question. And so you kind of touched on George Floyd a little bit earlier. And so, we've talked about Black Lives Matter. And so Black lives from George Floyd to Tyree Nichols recently, to Ahmaud Arbery, to Breonna Taylor, have all been lost unjustly at the hand of people sworn to uphold the law, and everyday citizens who feel that they can police Black bodies. So how does systemic racism play a role in this, and how can we help dismantle that?
Well, a few things I want to say about policing. And first, I want to acknowledge the grief many of us feel, with just the ongoing slaughters. And not just slaughters, but brutality, right? There are a lot of people who don't necessarily die in a police encounter, but they're harmed physically, psychologically. Communities and families are impacted over the course of generations. On any given year, the group that experiences the highest rate of police killings per capita, it's either African Americans or Native Americans. And if we don't know about our history of colonialism and our history of anti-Blackness, we can't understand those contemporary statistics. So policing, this makes me think of something, again, we talked about in the earlier workshop today on anti-racist pedagogy. That's something I'm really passionate about, and I love to help communities address, right? How do you teach about not just racism, but anti-racism? One of the things we looked at is a book called Black Power by Charles Hamilton and Stokely Carmichael. It comes out of the Black Power movement and the work of a political scientist. And they actually give us in that book the first academic definition of institutional racism, which is a phrase I know everyone in this room has heard before. It comes out of that activism. And what they point out in Black Power is that what's unique or important to remember about institutional racism is that it's hidden. It's often covert. Unlike looking at a video, which I have to say, I never watched the full video of George Floyd's murder. I will not do it. I haven't watched the full video of what happened to Tyree Nichols. For my mental health and well-being, I refuse. I was asked to do some TV thing about it, which is one of the most difficult aspects of my work, right? It's when tragedy strikes that often the media comes calling. And sometimes I feel that I have the capacity and the energy to do it. And I often say no when I know that I can't and I won't, and I'm gonna do something else. But didn't watch those videos. But when we see those kinds of incidents, violent, overt killings that are obviously racist, it's easier to denounce and react to than what we can't see behind closed doors. We can't easily see what prosecutors are doing behind closed doors, what decisions judges are making behind closed doors. We can't easily see how curricula are being structured, who's paying for textbooks, who's publishing we can't see institutional and structural racism as easily as some of these overt, obvious cases, such as the ones you name. But policing, when we look at the history of policing, it's rooted in anti-Blackness. It's rooted in the history of slavery and slave patrols. And so I guess one of the most important things I try to convey to folks, whether it's in the classroom or just in the media or just in general, if we could simply move away from the idea that we're dealing with, random cases of violence, or they talk about bad apples, or there's a bad police officer, and move to a structural understanding of policing. And I'm learning a lot from abolitionists about this. And I've been on a journey to learn about abolition because years ago I was like, what do you mean abolish the police? What do you even mean? What do you mean? And I grew up very naive about these issues. I talked about it in How to Be Less Stupid About Race, and in the earlier workshop. My family didn't talk about racism and I'm not a black man, I wasn't a black boy, so I didn't get a certain kind of talk that's more common for black men and black boys. To be very honest, I'm gonna tell a quick story and then I wanna hear from you all with some questions or comments if you have them. When I was a kid, I must have been like 8, 9 years old, and they had recently done one of these things at school where they invite like a police officer to class. And it's but you're having fun. It's like, oh, the community police officer, and then they had the DARE program and all that. So we had, as a kid, this like Disney version of the police, like, oh, these are our friends, And so I was about 8 years old. It was some random night during the week, and I'm an only child, and I have a single mom. And I knew she was supposed to be home by the time Jeopardy went off. I think that's what it was. Like when Jeopardy goes off, mom would be home from work or whatever. Jeopardy went off and she didn't come home. And then I think Wheel of Fortune came on and then that went off. And then it was, I was like, okay. So what do you think I did? I called the police. I called 911. And I don't even know what I said. I said, my mom's not home, So they came to our apartment. And what do you think happened next? Child Protective Services could have been called. That's not what happened, but that's very well what could have happened. All manner of horror could have happened. This is what happened. They came over. I made popcorn. They ate the popcorn with me and watched, I don't know what it was, ABC, whatever the sitcom, but we sat and watched. This is the crazy shit. Right? We watched sitcoms and we ate popcorn with the cops. My mom comes home and she sees the lights were still like the siren lights were on. And she was like, what has happened, right? Child Protective Services was not called by some miracle. Nobody was manhandled or harmed, And so that could have been a tragedy, right? On so many different levels. It also could have been an opportunity for my mom to talk to me about the police and maybe next time I'm running late, do not call 911. None of that happened. I did not understand what was at stake until decades later. I didn't know how close we came to tragedy. Could have been family separation. It could have, right? So all of this to say, many, 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 many people in this country grow up with a distorted Disney sanitized version of the police, particularly if you're in a community where they do behave as though they're your friend. If you know, especially the wealthier you are, it turns out, the nicer the police are to you. And so, but if you are on the flip side from a community that has been directly harmed and targeted by the police, if you've experienced police brutality, if you've lost a loved one to it, then you have a completely different understanding of what we're up against. So it's just to understand those connections, that it's structural, that we're not dealing with bad apples, we're dealing with, you know, a whole long ongoing history of racist policing. And it's not just racist policing, we have to look at violence and harm that's caused by policing that's not even just about, I mean, we could look at gender and domestic violence and prevalence among police officers, and just this myth that we're taught to believe, I say we, but not all of us, but some of us are taught to believe the police can keep us safe. But it's often when they show up that harm that otherwise would not have happened can occur. And when harm does happen, if you're interested in things like sexual assault and rape, police officers don't help track down those kinds of crimes. There are all kinds of crimes that police don't actually do any work around. And so part of what I'm learning from abolition is we need to think about what kinds of interventions and organizations and response teams do we need that police are not trained and are not capable of addressing. And how can we follow Dr. King's footsteps and think about, well, if we take away funding from things like war, from, you know, things like state violence, and we put that funding into social services, education, you know, teams of people who can respond to people dealing with the effects of mental illness, for example, that police officers are generally not trained to deal with, right? And so we see, have a high prevalence of disabled persons of various backgrounds, right? You could be white and disabled, and your risk of being killed in a police encounter are elevated. So this is what I'm learning from abolition. It's less about like, oh, get rid of police officers tomorrow. It's more about how can we invest in building the kind of society that can actually address harm and keep us safer. Because what we've got going on now is not working. And we need to see the structural issues and not think that it's random. Now we want to hear from y'all, right?
Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Fleming,
you for these
great
questions.
facilitated conversation.
Thank you.
So now we're going to open it up to our wonderful crowd.
I'm going to grab some water.
And
I think it's
we're going to let you ask questions of our speaker. So anyone have a question they want
or
to ask?
comment or
Raise
something
your
you want
hand
to
and I'll
share.
bring the microphone to you. Mr. Gaither.
First off, thank you again, Dr. Fleming, for coming all the way to the Pacific Northwest
My pleasure.
and giving us such an amazing information. So this is a two-part question, and you kind of addressed it in the workshop, but for those who weren't here. So some of the talking points around critical race theory from the opponents is, oh, we're teaching 5-year-olds despair, you know, and we're teaching 5-year-olds racism and that they're victims and victimizations, and we know that's not true. However, when I think about Derek Bell and his talk on the permanence of racism, and I start thinking about the pessimism that is sort of in the talking points of critical race theory whenever you really do like look at it and study it. And the feeling that we are pushing against a wall, and the fact that, you know, it seems like the foundation of our society is built on racism and it is permanent. So the first question is, at what age should we start talking to children about these difficult issues? And what's your advice to us who feel like we're pushing against a wall? You know, what are some inner resources we can kind of use to cultivate those our I don't want to use the term resilience because that's not what I'm trying to
But
say.
I hear you, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. Such rich and important perspective that you're bringing to these questions, especially about the inner resources, but pessimism. Couple of things about pessimism. I have to be really honest. I used to be a more pessimistic person. My partner is named Kay. She's half Japanese and half white American. And the name Kay in Japanese means hope. And when we met, like, I was just like Eeyore. I'm gonna be honest, like, I was, especially like, you know, the kinds of things I study, and I was like, you know, shit is fucked up. You know, you got the Anthropocene is happening, the sixth mass extinction. We didn't even get into climate catastrophe. It's just like the list of catastrophes, right? And then also exposure on social media to just all manner of awful, awful happenings. So I was very pessimistic. And I was interested in not just like Derek Bell. Derek Bell's a critical race scholar, he passed away, but one of his notions, as we just heard, was about the permanence of racism. Now, the flip side of Derek Bell's perspective, he thought that it's permanent. As long as the United States exists, Derek Bell argued it will be racist. That was his argument. Not all CRT scholars agree, but it is an idea that has been influential and that people debate with. But the flip side of that pessimism is about the permanence of the struggle. So his notion wasn't that you give up. It's that you keep struggling and you don't have the misperception that it's just gonna be, we're gonna, you know, fix this thing in a couple of days, months, years, decades. So I personally, so for many reasons, one of which was an intentional decision, I knew that I could not continue, not just to do this work, but like to enjoy my life if I stayed as pessimistic as I was. But also I met Mariame Kaba. I don't know if any people have heard of Mariame Kaba. She's a prominent abolitionist organizer and educator. And if you're on Twitter, if you're lucky, she might let you follow her. Her Twitter handle is Prison Culture, because she's done a lot of work around carceral issues. I had an opportunity to meet her years ago, and I was talking to her about like the pessimism I felt and all that, and she was like, Crystal, you can't be really that pessimistic. And I was like, what you mean I can't? I am, what you mean? But that's how I feel. And she was like, no, you can't. I know you can't really be that pessimistic because you're an educator. And I was like, that's right. I got these students and they inspire me and I see what they're learning and I see what I learn from them and I see what they do after they leave my classroom and they write me and they come back and they share and it's true. And that's why pedagogy is so important to me. It's unusual, those of you who weren't at the workshop today, it's an anti-racist pedagogy workshop. I do this kind of work for different institutions. It's unusual for a research professor like myself to do this kind of work. It's more common if you work at a small liberal arts college, et cetera. But early in my career at Stony Brook, where I teach, I really began to value much more seriously, right, pedagogy and caring about my students and seeing the connection between the transformations they were making and my own transformations learning from my students. So that's part of why I'm less pessimistic. But I'll say this about Derek Bell and the idea of the permanence of racism. I find myself somewhere in between, right? And I talked about this a little bit earlier today. I think it's really important not to allow folks to be super naive and think that we can wave a magic wand and somehow racism is going to be over. I still hear people to this day say things like, well, I thought we'd be over these issues by now. You know, I didn't think, I'd have to, be seeing, racism still existing. And I'm like, why? Because you were doing the work? Is that why you were surprised? Because you dedicated your life to this? And no, it's because people who are doing the work, you see what we're up against. And you're looking at history too. So even though I'm not going to pretend as though, the latest headlines and the latest atrocities don't still shock something in me, but it's more of a shock of consciousness than it is of, wow, this is still happening. Sometimes I have that reaction, but then I'm like, yeah, I know. It's a conversation with myself. Yes, this is still happening, and this is why. So it's important not to be naive and to have this kind of magical thinking about racism or the idea that young people are just gonna, like, it's just gonna age out. Unfortunately, right, whether it's Dylan Roof or the latest, you know, young white supremacists, white nationalists, or not even only white folks, right, who do racially motivated, racist, violent attacks. We know that it doesn't disappear with subsequent generations, in part because our culture is structured in the way that Dr. King understood it to be. Generation after generation learns racism. That's why it doesn't disappear. It's learned, and so we have to change our culture. We have to change the structures of our culture to build a culture of anti-racism. And that requires working together in community and institutions, and budgets are moral documents, right? What are you investing in? What are you telling people to value in your community? So that's where I am with like hope. And then the internal resources, I know this is connected to some of your work, right? So joy is an important part of any kind of political struggle. Anything that you're involved in that is really about facing the harsh realities of injustice. For my own humanity and flourishing, I also have to take care of myself, which means I can't only be in struggle mode. My therapist explained that will literally burn me out, right? So it's like, how do we nurture, I don't mean self-care, right? But yes, but community care. What resources do we need to take care of each other so that we can sustain ourselves for the long term? So bringing joy into the work, bringing care and compassion for yourself and for community members into the work. Fun, frivolity, like, you know, and that's also, I think, part of what I bring a little to How to Be Less Stupid About Race, that yes, it's about racism and the struggle, but it's also about fun things and, you know, just a wider range of expression and experience. So that's how I would answer your question. Thank you.
For those of you here at WSU that are looking for internal resources, Tremaine teaches a fantastic mindfulness program. So be on the lookout for that. You know, he has several trainings, so make sure you sign up for that. It can give you the resources and tools that you're looking for to not burn out at this work, as she said.
Mindfulness is so important. Meditation, yoga surprised me because my mom tried to get me into yoga when I was young, and I was just like, I don't like downward dog. This doesn't feel good. So I would like do it over the years. I never liked it. And then last year I was like, you know, for different reasons, I was actually involved in a group of contemplative scholars, people who work on meditation and mindfulness, who are global majority folk. And I was a mentor for that. And my mentee does a lot of somatic work around embodiment. And because I'm an intellectual, sometimes I'm just too in my head. So meditation, I still practice every day, but doing yoga every day, it's like now I'm doing it differently, right? I'm doing it in a way that feels good. I'm not putting any pressure on myself, but that's a big part of what, like I did it today. I did it before the workshop. I did yoga in my hotel room. I brought a yoga mat. I'm crazy. A foldable kind you can put in your luggage. But you know, I try to fill up my tank because otherwise, what am I gonna share with you, right?
And for those of you who are on Zoom, if you have questions, please put it in the chat and we will try to read it out if you have any. Does anybody in the room have a question? Okay, sure.
Thank you. So I can't remember, I can't pronounce her name right. So, but I read the book. So you want to talk about race?
Yeah.
And I got to hear her speak in Spokane a few years ago. And one of the things she said is, while she was away one time, she was swatted. And so for those who don't know what swatted means, it's someone calls and says that there's something horrific happening at your home, and her teenage son was home. And so she called her son and was like, get up, go sit on the front steps. The cops are gonna come to your house or come to our house. do not resist, just don't do anything, because she was fearful that her teenage son would be killed.
Yep.
And so I know that it's important for us to do the work, but how do you address that real fear that this system is not made to really want to change? And so when there's people like us who are trying to go against the system,
Yep.
like our very lives could be in danger.
Yes.
Because that scares me. I mean,
Yes.
you know, we have 2 children,
Yes.
and one is a young man.
Yes.
And you know, our 18-year-old daughter, and I'm like, I don't want to put their lives in danger, but I also want to teach them not to give up either.
Yes. That is such a real question and a real life dilemma. And so I appreciate you, and I see you, and I see my own fears over the years. I know before How to Be Less Stupid About Race came out, my mom was really, really worried. You know, I was going to have before COVID, a big national tour. And, you know, we know about these kinds of targeted attacks. And we know about it from history. Ida B. Wells, one of my sheroes, when she began to write about the real cause of lynching, which meant that she was going to address, and she did it publicly in her newspaper, right, how white men who were sexually assaulting black women and girls were creating false charges of sexual assault and rape against black men, and they themselves never held to account for their own implication in sexual violence and rape. When she wrote words to that effect, they, not only did she deal with death threats, they burned down her newspaper office in Memphis. And then she had to leave and go to, I think she went to Chicago next. So we can go further back still. Just imagine the terror. And it's hard to really imagine it, but if we imagine the terror of the plantation, the literal terror, right? Physical violence and psychological fear of if you challenge this system, you have no rights that the white man is bound to respect. That was the law of the land with regard to enslaved people. I share this because anyone who does any work along these lines has to deal literally with the fear of death. It means you have to be and find the resources to be death-defying. It's, you know, we're here at an event in honor of a man who was assassinated. He knew that that risk was there. And whether it is a risk that is likely to happen or not, that psychological weight is real. It's used to intimidate. It's used to fearmonger people into silence, right? So a couple of things about that. One is to acknowledge it is a real thing. On the other hand, we also have these histories of people who had even more, you know, kind of constant death threats, right? And I'm thinking of, it's crazy. Who was the name of the black base? He was called Hammer, the black baseball player who broke Babe Ruth's record. Hank Aaron, right? If you read his autobiography, the death threats he got just for breaking the record. It's not even for like marching for justice, just for breaking the record. I think he got more death threats in the US mail than anyone ever had gotten before, right? And part of what he did was to talk about it, like Ijeoma talked about it, right? It's more common than you might think to literally get death threats. So one thing is that helps me is to educate myself about that. It helps to kind of also like, I'm not saying it's not as scary, but it's like, well, okay, well, this is a common intimidation tactic. You also have to educate yourself and community members about how do you respond to or even know when a threat needs to be taken seriously. And there are organizations that specialize in community safety for activists and advocates where you're not gonna do what I did at 8 years old and the first inclination is to call the police. Although there could be occasions where that might be something you consider doing, but you have other options to address safety. And I think doing that kind of work when you are not being targeted and attacked in that way, it's the ideal time to do it. Because when you're dealing with the crisis, it's hard to then go find out, well, what do I do? So I would say I would advise anyone who's involved in any way, and this is not just advice for individuals, institutions need to have safety plans, and usually our academic institutions, among others, are not very good at this, and especially not good at thinking in an abolitionist way. What do you do that's not just calling the police? When the police usually, when you call them, when they're doxing or hate crimes, they very rarely do anything. So that's how I would respond, like, yeah, I feel you. And also, going back to the internal resources, like, everyone's different, right? For me, my spirituality and my faith, very important for me, right? For all kinds of reasons, but with this having to be death-defying. How do we think about death? It's a very personal, intimate, complicated topic. And it's something that I'm not Buddhist, but Buddhist writings on death and sort of coming to some kind of terms or peace with that. Thich Nhat Hanh is someone who's like one of my heroes. He passed away a little more than a year ago, or maybe it was a year ago exactly almost. He was a Vietnamese peace activist, and he founded something called Engaged Buddhism. And talk about defying death and the fear of death. He was a peace protester in the midst of the Vietnam War. And so he wasn't into this kind of spirituality that's like spiritual bypassing, kumbaya, it's all good. It was like, no, he has been, in the firing line. And this, he has tons of writings around how do we nurture ourselves, acknowledge our fears, but fill ourselves up in community so that, we can take care of our fear and also pay attention to it because it's information. So thank you for that question. Thank you.
Okay, we're coming up on time, so we'll got one more question. And then those who are here for common reading, I'll give you instructions, and then we'll dismiss. So anybody have a final question? Yep. Okay. Well,
I have a quick question.
Sure.
If you don't mind. So as a person, I would want to become a lawyer,
Okay.
particularly a criminal defense attorney.
Okay.
And I've taken classes here at WSU, and I think they do an okay job of basic overview stuff.
Okay.
But as a person, also thank you very much for all of this wonderful knowledge, because I'm very intrigued to learn more, particularly about critical race theory. For me, where do I begin? How do I take a deeper dive?
I have a book for you. Okay, well, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, honestly. That is, but I know you're going to be a lawyer. So, a couple of things. One is a book called The Critical Race Theory Reader. Kimberly Crenshaw is one of the editors, but it's quite legalistic, which might be up your alley. Another book, which is written by a sociologist, just came out last year, gets into a lot of the legal scholarship, but also with a bit of a broader lens, bringing in sociology and I think some Black studies too. That book is called On Critical Race Theory by Victor Ray, who's a sociologist in Iowa. I would recommend those as places to start. Yeah, those are two recommended sources. Okay, 3, including my book. Yeah. You're welcome. Speaking of books, I know we got to end, but I just have to tell you, because my publisher would be mad if I didn't make the plug. Earlier, we do have the picture of Rise Up, How You Can Join the Fight Against White Supremacy. It's my first YA book, but it's actually good also for first-year college students, even maybe sophomores, 12 to 18-year-olds, so 18, 19-year-olds. My publisher wants y'all to know that it's on sale for $2.99 in honor of Black History Month. The ebook is being promoted for only $2.99. So if you read it, if you've already checked it out, I'd love to hear from you. Also, if you read How to Be Less Stupid About Race, you can hit me up, send me an email. You might or might not see me on Twitter, but you can always write me on my Stony Brook email. And it was wonderful to meet you all. Thank you so much for your questions.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sutton. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out. Samantha, are you here? Okay. For those of you who are looking for common reading credit, please see Samantha over there, and she can get your information and make sure you get that credit. Also, I mentioned Tremaine Gaither's training. It's called Mindfulness-Based Anti-Racism Program, and it's for faculty and staff. You can register on the Provost webpage. And also every other Monday, he offers a mindfulness drop-in session via Zoom. And so that's open to the entire campus community. So if you want to kind of get into that mindfulness space and figure out how you can work through those processes in DEI, that's your guy right there. And so those are opportunities for you. If you need, or if you're looking for information, go to the Provost page. Again, thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you, Louise and Joel, for your wonderful poems.
Yes.
And have a great rest of your night and have a safe drive home. Thank you.
Thank you.